Chapter 3. God, the Reluctant Divorcee. God's marriage contract and the grounds for his divorce from Israel. The following is not a true story. A man, let's call him Fred, went to a cheese and wine function where he was cornered by a church minister wearing a very tall clerical collar. Nervous, Fred mumbled to the minister that he wasn't really a religious person. Unfortunately, this appeared to make the minister even more interested in him, so Fred was relieved when they were interrupted by a woman with a tray of drinks. Gratefully, Fred took a glass, but then the minister sniffed the tray suspiciously and said to the lady in an embarrassingly loud voice, "I would rather commit adultery than drink alcohol." Poor Fred, realizing he had done something wrong but not sure what it was, put his drink back on the tray and said, "I'm very sorry. I didn't know there was a choice." We can laugh at this because adultery is such a normal part of modern life. We are aghast when some countries punish adultery with imprisonment, or even the death penalty. In the ancient Near East, however, adultery was always a capital offense, and often the husband was expected to carry out the punishment. Even suspected adultery resulted in a trial by ordeal in the temple. The woman had to drink a special mixture that supposedly harmed only the guilty. See the details in Numbers 5. In much of the ancient world, adultery was regarded as seriously as murder. Although today we may not put adultery in the same bracket as murder, it can certainly kill a marriage. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Under Old Testament law, if someone was found to have committed adultery, the punishment was not always the death penalty, but it did result in the death of a marriage. Quote, "When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house." Deuteronomy 24:1. The words "some indecency" in this text could be more literally translated "a thing of nakedness" or "a cause of sexual immorality," and they most likely refer to adultery. Some say that this sexual immorality could not have been adultery because adulterers were killed, Leviticus 20:10. However, the death penalty was not always carried out, since Old Testament law was not applied uniformly throughout its history. This is God's lovingly realistic way of dealing with the consequences of human sinfulness. The victim of adultery should have the choice of whether to end the marriage or not. Adultery is not, of course, the only sin that can end a marriage. Many marriages are killed by neglect or abuse. Christians today accept that the Bible allows divorce for adultery, but many believe that it does not allow divorce for reasons such as physical or emotional abuse, or when a man withholds money from his wife, or stops her going out, or when a wife neglects the children and leaves them filthy and starving. This has led Christians to feel confused and concerned because they conclude that God isn't interested in such things, that these issues don't seem to touch his heart. But why? Why is adultery more valid a reason for divorce than cruelty? Why wouldn't God allow divorce in these situations? And why wouldn't a victim be allowed, at the very least, the choice of leaving such a marriage? 3 more biblical grounds for divorce. In fact, the Bible does have a law that addresses this situation. Exodus 21:10-11 is a text that is usually forgotten, but it provides precisely what is needed, for it allows the victim of abuse or neglect to be freed from the marriage. This text is actually a law about a slave who has married her master. It states the rights that she has if he decides to marry a second wife. This law tells him to make sure he doesn't neglect his first wife when he marries a second. Quote, "If he takes another wife to himself, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her conjugal love. And if he does not do these 3 things for her, she shall go out for nothing, without payment of money." Exodus 21:10-11. At first glance, this text doesn't seem to apply to us at all, since we don't have polygamy and we don't marry slaves, though in some marriages it may seem like it. But we will see that it actually applies to all marriages. Polygamy was allowed in the Old Testament, and human nature being what it is, when a man took a second wife, he often neglected his first wife and favored the new one. This was especially likely if his first wife had been a slave before he married her. So the point of this law was to ensure that the first wife was treated fairly. It says that the husband would not be permitted to withhold food, clothing, or conjugal love from her. If he did neglect any of these, she would be able to go free. That is, she could get divorced. Before we dismiss this as irrelevant to our marriages today, it is important to remember that this is case law, not statute law, which means that the principles are more important than the details. Then, as now, some laws were written as statutes, summarizing a whole subject area, such as divorce, while other laws were case law. Case law is a collection of decisions made by judges in actual cases that established a new legal principle. These rulings can then be applied to other cases that share something in common with the case that established the principle. For example, the statute law on keeping the Sabbath is part of the 10 Commandments, Exodus 20, 8-11, but it does not define the punishment for breaking it. When a man was caught gathering sticks on the Sabbath in Numbers 15, 32-36, his case was brought before Moses, who decided that he deserved death. This story, with the decision about the punishment, became an item of case law. The principle derived from it is that breaking the Sabbath law makes one liable to the death penalty. Exodus 21, 10-11 is case law, so we have to ignore the details about slavery and polygamy and look for the principles that apply to all marriages that involve neglect. The rabbis found the following principles in this text, and I think they were right. They reasoned that if a slave wife had the right to divorce a husband who neglected to supply food, clothing, and conjugal love, then a free wife would certainly also have this right. And they argued that if one of 2 wives had this right, so did an only wife. Furthermore, if a wife had these rights, then a husband was also entitled to divorce a wife who neglected him. The biblical principle that is established, therefore, is the right of someone to divorce their partner if they neglect their vow to provide food, clothing, or conjugal love. 4 marriage vows. This means that the Old Testament recognizes 4 grounds for divorce. The first 3 are neglecting to provide food, clothing, and conjugal love by either husband or wife, and the 4th is committing adultery. These 4 obligations parallel the vows exchanged by couples in Jewish marriages. They promise to feed, clothe, exchange conjugal love with, and be faithful to each other. The man agreed to provide food and clothing, the woman agreed to cook and sew, and they both agreed to share conjugal love and be faithful. Actually, technically, only a wife could be divorced for adultery, because a man could have more than 1 wife. This did not make it okay for him to commit adultery, but it meant he could not be divorced for doing so because he had not promised sexual fidelity to his wife alone. Well, that's how some rabbis argued, but I'm not sure I agree. They also said that Deuteronomy 24:1 speaks only about adultery by a woman, but Deuteronomy 24:1-4 is another example of case law, in which principles are more important than the details, and the principle is that adultery is a ground for divorce. Jesus put an end to this loophole by teaching monogamy, so that adultery became an equal ground for divorce for both sexes, but I will leave the teachings of Jesus for another chapter. Thus, the Old Testament provided very sensible laws about divorce. Each partner had to keep his or her 4 marriage vows to feed, clothe, share conjugal love, and be faithful. The principles behind these vows were that they had to supply material support, food and clothing, and physical affection, conjugal love. Abusive situations were covered by these laws because physical abuse and emotional abuse are extreme forms of neglecting material support and physical affection. The only person who could choose to enact a divorce was the victim. If your partner broke his or her marriage vows, you could choose to divorce them, or you could choose to forgive them and try to salvage the marriage. You could not divorce a partner simply because you wanted to. This had changed by the time of Jesus, as we will see later. God's divorce. These 4 biblical grounds for divorce are illustrated by God's marriage to Israel, which ended unhappily in divorce when Israel sinned. Many of the Old Testament prophets speak about the problems in that relationship. Hosea was told to marry a prostitute who continued to be unfaithful to him in order to illustrate God's marriage to Israel. Hosea 1-3. Ezekiel described how Israel committed adultery with other gods along with other sins that led to the divorce. Ezekiel 16-23. Jeremiah warned Israel's sister nation, Judah, to watch out because she was heading the same way. Jeremiah 3-4. Isaiah brought the good news that unlike Israel, who was divorced, Judah had only suffered separation and that God wished for reconciliation. Isaiah 50. Thus, the Old Testament prophets describe God as a divorcee, and when you put together all the references, you find a clear and unanimous picture. God had married Israel at Mount Sinai in the wilderness, then brought his bride across the threshold of the Jordan into Palestine. There he gave her food, milk and honey, and wool for clothes, and of course he loved her and was faithful to her. In Palestine, however, Israel was introduced to many other gods and started to worship them, offering them sacrifices of food and ornaments. The prophets described this worship of other gods as spiritual adultery. The books of Moses and the historical books describe these same matters in different language. They portray God's relationship with Israel as a treaty covenant. Much of the book of Deuteronomy follows the normal structure of a treaty covenant, with a historical prologue, Deuteronomy 1-4, followed by stipulations of the covenant, 5-26, then the names of divine witnesses, Deuteronomy 4:26 and 26:16-19, and ending with the blessings and curses, Deuteronomy 27-28. This covenant treaty is just like an ancient Near Eastern treaty, in which both sides agree on what they will do, the stipulations, and the more powerful side makes promises for when these stipulations are kept and threats for when they are broken, the blessings and curses. They called this a contract, which is often translated as covenant. The 2 words have the same meaning, and there is only one Hebrew word, berith, behind them both. Some people think that a marriage should not be called a contract because it is a covenant. The difference is, they say, that a contract can be broken, but a covenant can never end even if the stipulations are constantly being violated. They say that national treaties and trade agreements are contracts, but when God makes an agreement with his people, it should be seen as a covenant. Such a covenant is seen preeminently in the new covenant that is made with Judah and Israel, Jeremiah 31:31, for which the New Testament is named. There are very big problems with this idea, the biggest of which is that covenant and contract are both translations of the same Hebrew word, so the idea of a distinction does not exist in the Bible. Although it is true that the new covenant is unbreakable and does not rely on our keeping the stipulations, this does not mean that every agreement that God makes is like this, or that marriage is like this. God's first covenant or contract with Israel, which he made at Mount Sinai, certainly had stipulations, the law, and curses and blessings that would result from violating or keeping these stipulations. Marriage is also regarded by Malachi as a contract that can be broken, and the prophets regarded God's marriage contract with Israel as breakable. A broken contract. An ancient treaty contract and an ancient marriage contract are both similar to a modern commercial contract. Both sides agree to stipulations, e.g., you build this and I'll pay you, and make promises, I'll pay you on time if you finish on time, with threats of penalties. There's a penalty of $1,000 if you don't finish on time. Mrs. Hopeful asked Mr. Oddjob, the builder, to build her a sunroom by the end of June. Her daughter was getting married in 8 weeks' time on July 1st, and the reception would be held in the sunroom and large garden at home. Mr. Oddjob was enthusiastic. "No problem, madam. My price just for you is $5,000. "That's a deal," she said, "so long as it's finished by July 1st. "Don't worry," he assured her. "It'll only take 20 days. but he neglected to say that he would spread the 20 days over 3 months. When the wedding day arrived, there was nothing but a muddy building site that the guests had to tramp across to reach the garden. The next day, Mrs. Hopeful called Mr. Oddjob. "You've broken our contract. I'll pay you $2,000 for your work so far, and I'll get someone else to finish the job." "You can't do that," he complained. "You agreed to a contract for the whole job." And that was just the start of a long story. Who was in the right, Mrs. Hopeful or Mr. Oddjob? I think the most fair-minded people would agree that Mrs. Hopeful had the right to end the contract because the builder broke one of the stipulations, that he would finish by July 1st, though a good lawyer might argue she did not use the magical legal phrase, "time is of the essence." In our law, as in ancient law, the victim of a broken contract can decide to end it, or the parties can decide to carry on in the hope that things will get better. God's contract, or covenant, with Israel also had stipulations, promises, and penalties. The stipulations were the 10 Commandments and the other laws. The promises were a peaceful life in the promised land he had given them, and the penalties were the removal of his protection and exile from that land. Sadly, as we know, the Israelites broke the commandments, so God sent them into exile just as he said he would in the contract. That is the way the historical books of the Old Testament treat the exile of Israel, as a broken treaty contract. But the prophets regarded God's relationship with Israel as a marriage contract. This contract was very similar. It too had stipulations, promises, and penalties. The stipulations were the vows to feed, clothe, and share conjugal love in faithfulness. The promise was a happy life together, and the penalty was divorce. Israel continually broke these stipulations until God eventually divorced her, and the prophets warned Judah that she was heading in the same direction. As Jeremiah said, "Judah saw that for all the adulteries of that faithless one, Israel, I had sent her away with a decree of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but she too went and played the whore." Jeremiah 3:8. Israel's broken marriage vows. Ezekiel was particularly interested in the grounds for God's divorce. He warned Judah that she was going the same way as her sister kingdom of Israel, Ezekiel 23:30-33. God had kept all 4 of his marriage vows. He loved Judah and gave her food and clothing fit for a queen, Ezekiel 16:8-13. And of course he was faithful to her. But in contrast, Judah broke all 4 marriage vows. She did not return God's love. She committed adultery with idols, Ezekiel 16:15. She presented idols with the food that God had given her, Ezekiel 16:19, and she decorated idols with the clothing and jewels with which God had honored her, Ezekiel 16:16-18. God warned Judah that he had already divorced Israel for these types of sins, Ezekiel 23:9. The remarkable message of the prophets was that although God had every right to divorce Judah, just as he had divorced her sister Israel, he decided to do something completely different. He decided to create a new covenant that would transform people from the inside. Unlike all God's previous covenants, and unlike any human covenant, this one could not be broken when one side failed to keep the stipulations, but it would continue unconditionally forever. Ezekiel 16:60-62. These prophecies were fulfilled in the New Testament, which is named for this new covenant, when Christ died for all sin. Even Israel was going to share in this restoration, not by remarrying God, but by rejoining Judah to become a single new nation. Ezekiel 37:15-28. Israel did not know anything about God's wonderful future plans while she was heading for divorce, and she stubbornly continued to break her marriage vows. All the prophets portray God acting in a forgiving and patient manner. He didn't divorce her immediately and gave her many chances to repent. But Israel, his wife, continued to sin, refusing to honor her vows, and God reluctantly had to divorce her. The marriage was broken and dead, and God merely carried out the legal formalities of divorce that recognized that fact. God hates divorce. We know now why God says in Malachi that he hates divorce. He knows from personal experience how much pain results from it. As he says in Malachi, divorce results from breaking marriage contract promises to which God himself was a witness. The Lord was witness between you and the wife of your youth, to whom you have been faithless, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. Malachi 2:14. God does not criticize the legal process of divorce or the person who carries it out. Otherwise, he would criticize himself, because he had to divorce Israel. God hates the breaking of marriage vows that results in divorce. He says that breaking these vows is being faithless because it breaks the marriage covenant or contract. A marriage is ended by the person who breaks the marriage vows, not by the wronged person who decides to end the broken contract by enacting a divorce. Divorce is usually terrible for both partners, but remaining married can often be worse. Suffering continued neglect or abuse can be physically and emotionally damaging, and continuing unfaithfulness can bring the whole institution of marriage into disrepute. Conclusion. Practical laws for a sinful world. We have seen that in the Old Testament, marriage is a contract, so it can be ended if one party breaks the stipulations that were agreed to in it, but only the person who has the right to end a contract but the only person who has the right to end a contract is the victim of broken promises. They can decide to continue, or they can decide that enough is enough. The Old Testament thus gives us some very practical laws on divorce. People cannot divorce their husband or wife simply because they want to, but only if their spouse has broken their marriage vows. Divorce is not compulsory. The wronged partner also has the choice to forgive and carry on in the marriage. Imagine the situation if Mrs. Hopeful had married Mr. Oddjob instead of employing him. They promised to feed, clothe, share conjugal love with, and be faithful to each other. And imagine that he started hitting her or spending all the housekeeping money. Would she have the right to end the marriage contract? Under Old Testament law, yes. Or imagine that she started taking lovers and spending his money on them. Would he have the right to divorce her? Under Old Testament law, yes. In the sad reality of this world, a marriage contract or covenant can most certainly be broken by partners who break their marriage vows. The Old Testament is aware of human sin and has practical laws to deal with its consequences. We will see that there is nothing to suggest that the New Testament is any less practical. We will see in chapter 5 that Jesus recognizes the necessity of divorce, but says that we should avoid it whenever possible.